I promise the advent of a tragic age. The highest art in the saying of yes to life, tragedy, will be born again when mankind has the knowledge of the hardest but most necessary of wars behind it, without, however, suffering from that knowledge. The Birth of Tragedy is Nietzsche's first book. It immediately split public opinion in half. Professors and academics hated it. Richard Wagner, who was not only Nietzsche's friend at the time, but also the most influential artist alive, loved it. The book was written when Nietzsche still had academic aspirations. At 24 years old, he had become the youngest professor ever to teach classical philology, the study of ancient Latin and Greek, at the Swiss University of Basel. A promising academic career lay in wait, were it not for the fact that 4 years later, when he published The Birth of Tragedy, all academic bridges were permanently burned. From this point onward, Nietzsche would become an anti-establishment thinker. The essayistic, traditional style of The Birth of Tragedy would make room for the mysterious aphorism. The Birth of Tragedy is early Nietzsche, the young Nietzsche, who still idolized Richard Wagner and called himself a disciple of Schopenhauer. The influence of these two men pervades this book. Later, when Nietzsche violently turned his back on these two influences, he also disavowed much of this work. In this video, we'll look at The Birth of Tragedy in its entirety. That includes the original text, of course, but also the foreword that Nietzsche added when he republished this work 14 years later, in which he discusses how his philosophy changed over the years. We've covered most of Nietzsche's books right here on the channel. Check out the description for a complete list. The ambition is to eventually cover all works of Nietzsche, so please subscribe if you don't want to miss these analyses. As mentioned before, Nietzsche later disavowed much of this work, but that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile to read the text as it was written and examine its arguments more closely. Keep in mind that most of what is said here would not represent Nietzsche's final thoughts on these matters. We'll take a deeper look at his disavowal of these ideas in the final part of the video, so stick around for the complete picture. With that said, let's start with an obvious question. What is The Birth of Tragedy about? For such a short work, it's really about two profound questions. What is a human culture, and is life worth living? You can guess these two questions are deeply related, but before we set about answering them, let's first set the stage. The Birth of Tragedy opens with one of those Nietzschean concepts that have become famous and influential in their own right, the distinction between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. It is in connection with Apollo and Dionysus, the two art deities of the Greeks, that we learn that there existed in the Grecian world a wide antithesis, an origin and aims between art of the shaper, the Apollonian, and the non-plastic art of music, that of Dionysus. Nietzsche identifies two principles, drives, or rather impulses in the creative spirit. They are at odds with each other, and from their complex play of struggle and reconciliation, art is born. Any given artwork is either Apollonian in nature, Dionysian, or a synthesis of both. They represent the two ways by which art can be approached. Apollo represents distinction, delineation, the setting of boundaries, and individuality. Apollonian art is all about setting itself apart. It's about moderation, reasonableness. It's the art of forms. All plastic arts are Apollonian. Sculpture, for example, or painting. But poetry can also be Apollonian. Apollonian art is all about individuality, and therein it hides a metaphysical truth. The art of Apollo is the art of illusion, by presenting and glorifying the individual, by promoting limits and distinctions, by carving out forms and contrasts, it mirrors and strengthens the metaphysical illusion of the principium individuationis, the principle of individuation that lies at the heart of the world as representation. The principium individuationis is a term coined by Arthur Schopenhauer. It's that principle by which we experience multiplicity in the world. Because of this principle, we experience the world in terms of time and space. Events follow one another as separate entities. Objects are made up of different parts. This panorama of experiences, once it passes through the faculties of the mind, creates our experience of the world as representation, the world as we ordinarily perceive it. But this world is an illusion. In Schopenhauer's metaphysical system, which Nietzsche accepts rather uncritically in this work, the true kernel of existence is not found in the world of representation, but in the world as will, the world as it exists outside or rather beyond space and time. Schopenhauer believes in the fundamental unity of the will. Schopenhauer believes that all is one. Time and space do not exist in the world as it really is. They are illusions brought forth by the intellect and the perceiving mind. These illusions are amplified in the Apollonian artwork. Here too we are presented with an illusion, a rather more obvious one. We know instinctively that a piece of sculpture is fake, that it's not a real man standing before us, that it merely represents a man. We can therefore say that Apollonian art is related to the world as representation. If Apollo represents forms, delineation, demarcation, order, and reason, then Dionysus is the opposite. The Dionysian is the human drive towards formlessness, chaos, the blurring of lines, ecstasy, exaltation, emotion. Apollo is the principium individuationis. Dionysus is the collapse of that principle, the ecstasy brought forth by the pleasure that is felt in transgression, in breaking convention, even in forgetting ourselves. The ego, after all, is Apollonian. The ego is simply the principium individuationis applied to our self-consciousness, the means by which we differentiate between ourselves and others. In the domain of the Dionysian, even this fundamental difference disappears. Is it any wonder Dionysus is the god of wine and drunkenness? It is either under the influence of the narcotic draught of which the hymns of all primitive men and peoples tell us, or by the powerful approach of spring penetrating all nature with joy, that those Dionysian emotions awake, in the augmentation of which the subjective vanishes to complete self-forgetfulness. The Dionysian art par excellence is music. Music, of course, is formless. Unlike painting or sculpture, music is not a representational art. It has no spatial component. It's not merely coincidental that music is viewed by many as the most powerful art form. Music seems to hold a special sway over us. It can move us in ways that a painting or a sculpture cannot, at least not as easily. It's well known that Schopenhauer considered music to be the highest art, standing above the other arts with considerable distance. Music stands alone, quite cut off from all the other arts. In it, we do not recognize the copy or repetition of any idea of existence in the world. Yet it is such a great and exceedingly noble art. Its effect on the inmost nature of man is so powerful, and it is so entirely and deeply understood by him in his inmost consciousness as a perfectly universal language. In The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche still considered himself a disciple of Schopenhauer's, and even though he would later turn against his mentor's philosophy as a whole, he would always remain convinced of the primacy of music. In this respect, he never deviated from Schopenhauer. Nietzsche concedes that poetry has the potential to be, at least partly, Dionysian in nature, but it is music through which Dionysian sentiments are most easily expressed. With these two concepts, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, Nietzsche laid bare a drive or a current present in the soul of the ancient Greeks. Of course, even though The Birth of Tragedy is nominally about the Greeks, it's also about us. Human nature is human nature, after all. But these two drives, these two opposing values of the Apollonian and the Dionysian, found their most perfect expression in the culture and the art of the ancient Greeks, because the ancient Greeks invented something we call tragedy. The great writers of Greek tragedy, Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides, didn't arise out of nowhere. They were part of a tradition that went back far before their time. In The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche traces the evolution and development of this art form. He assumes the role of the philologist and gives us his best explanations as to how and why Greek tragedy arose out of Hellenic culture, utilizing, of course, the twin concepts of Apollo and Dionysus, which he just added to the science of aesthetics. We shall now have to avail ourselves of all the principles of art hitherto considered, in order to find our way through the labyrinth, as we must designate the origin of Greek tragedy. It all starts with the chorus. Ancient Greek tragedy consists of two elements, the chorus and the drama proper. The chorus, of which the word choir. The drama itself is played by the actors, individualized, named performers who engage in dialogue. If you think about the theater today, you probably don't envision a group of 12 to 50 performers singing and dancing along with the drama and giving occasional commentary on what is happening on stage. In fact, most theater productions in the modern era don't feature any music at all. But Greek tragedy starts with the chorus, and all the elements that we associate with theater today evolved out of the chorus, not the other way around. This historical trend is important to Nietzsche's analysis. We even get a hint of this in the full title of the work, The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music. The Nietzschean thesis is that pure music, the first stage of Greek tragedy, was too much to handle for the Greeks. Music is the ultimate form of Dionysian art. But what does this mean exactly? Let's go back to Schopenhauer's views on music for just a moment. Music is as direct an objectification and copy of the whole will as the world itself. Music is thus by no means, like the other arts, the copy of ideas, but a copy of the will itself, whose objectivity the ideas are. This is why the effect of music is so much more powerful and penetrating than that of the other arts, for they speak only of shadows, but music speaks of the thing itself. For Schopenhauer, music is the most powerful art form because music speaks directly to us, without mediation in the form of representation. Let's illustrate with an example. Consider these sunflowers. They are representational pictures. The artist took something from the world as representation, namely his impression of a vase with sunflowers, and set about creating a copy of this impression on the canvas. But we shouldn't forget that for Schopenhauer, our regular experience of the world is illusory in nature. The world as representation is only one half of the story. In Schopenhauer's metaphysics, the true world is the world as will. The world as representation arises out of the interplay between the perceiving subject and the perceived object. Our mind takes the raw material of unmediated reality, and it molds it to something intelligible to our reason. We add, so to speak, time, space, and causality to this raw picture of reality, and we thereby create something we can experience, something our minds are equipped to handle. What this means for our ordinary experience of reality is that we are constantly living in an illusion, a picture created by our mind. If we therefore want to say something about the world as it really is, in other words, if we want to engage in metaphysics, then we must concede that the material world is not the world we should investigate. Rather, metaphysics must be about the real world, the world beneath the illusion. But because we cannot escape the human experience, so to speak, the very purpose of metaphysics is called into question. We cannot escape our mind and think outside of our own thoughts. It's a paradox. For this reason, Immanuel Kant believed that metaphysics was impossible. Schopenhauer disagreed. Maybe we cannot conceive or think of the world beyond the illusory veil of representation, but we can certainly feel it. Through the experience of our body, feelings of hunger, pain, sadness, joy, through the sensation that we really inhabit our body, the observation common to everyone that our body is not just an object among objects. This type of knowledge is of a different order than other knowledge. It's not derived from our experience of the world as representation, but it's something different altogether. Schopenhauer reasons that the sensation of being in our bodies is the small gate through which we can catch a glimpse of true metaphysical knowledge, knowledge about the world as it really is, the world of reality. He called this will. But what does all of this have got to do with music? The knowledge of our body that Schopenhauer talks about is not representational in nature. It's not mediated through the senses, strictly speaking. It's immediate knowledge. And it's immediate precisely because it's not representational knowledge. Now let's take a look at the painting of the sunflowers again. The difference between this painting and a piece of music is that this painting is firmly representational. The artist took an impression of the illusory world of representation and made a copy of it. Can we say the same about music? Which scene of reality is music copying? What does music represent? Schopenhauer argues, nothing. Music does not represent anything. This is what separates music from other art forms. But music must be about something. About what? Well, there are only two possibilities. Knowledge is either mediated through the senses, or it is immediate. Since music is not mediated, since it is not representational, it must be something different. It must be immediate. And what did Schopenhauer equate with immediate knowledge? Knowledge of our own body, knowledge of the will, knowledge of the true reality of the world. This is the full meaning behind Schopenhauer's famous quote on music, which is often stripped of this all too important context. Music is the direct copy of the will itself, and therefore exhibits itself as the metaphysical to everything physical in the world, and as the thing in itself to every phenomenon. We might, therefore, just as well call the world embodied music as embodied will. In short, for Schopenhauer, music is a pretty big deal. Earlier, we mentioned how the will is one. Because the will is undifferentiated in time and space, it dissolves the principle of individuation. Space, separation, demarcation, succession, these are things that belong to the world as representation. In the domain of the will, there is no you or me, no here or there, no now, no then. There is only one endless present, all time and all space contained within. And this is where we leave Schopenhauer and let Nietzsche enter the discussion with his conception of the Dionysian. In the beginning, there was the chorus. No drama, no dialogue. Pure music and dance. Like we mentioned earlier, Nietzsche's argument is that this form of tragedy was too much for the Greeks to handle. Now that we're equipped with some theoretical background, we finally understand why. In experiencing and engaging with the chorus, the ancient Greeks were exposed to a kind of truth that is simply too much to bear. Nietzsche argued that by watching the chorus, Greeks became intoxicated. He uses the German word Rausch, which means intoxication, ecstasy, but also has connotations of bliss or enthusiasm. Compare the English word rush. A forgetting of oneself and losing one's own individuality, being subsumed into the crowd. Music is the ultimate art form capable of doing this. It still happens today at EDM raves or rock concerts, for example. By identifying music with the will, both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche assigned it a supreme value. Quite literally, music is truth. Or rather, it communicates truth. One such truth concerns the ultimate unity of the universe. This is why music, like no other art form, allows us to forget ourselves. This is also why music is one of the only art forms that we enjoy in a group setting. In the musical experience, the dividing line between ourselves and others becomes blurred, and for a brief moment we get a glimpse of ultimate reality, beyond the illusions of the material world. Remember also how we said that the Dionysian, for Nietzsche, is the art form that dissolves boundaries, destroys limits, and is all about chaos, as opposed to the Apollonian, which is all about delineation, limits, and order. But another such truth that music communicates is much, much darker. This glimpse of ultimate reality, it's not a blissful experience. Quite the contrary. The world beyond our illusions, the world as will, is horrifying. There is nothing redeeming about it. Schopenhauer, through philosophical reflection in his main work, came to the conclusion that the will is three things. 1. The will is fundamentally irrational. It has no end goal and no guiding principle. It just is. 2. The will is blind. It does its thing without regard for anything except itself. It spares nothing and it saves nothing. 3. The will is ever striving, without beginning and without end. The will carries on its way. There is no redemption at the end, because there is no end. So what the world really is, according to Schopenhauer and to the Nietzsche who wrote The Birth of Tragedy, is a place of endless, blind, irrational striving, the continual march of desire, the everlasting hunger of the all-devouring will. In other words, the world is a place of suffering, total, irredeemable, complete, endless suffering. And music gives us a glimpse into this terrifying world. And the chorus of ancient Greek proto-tragedy as well gave the Greeks a glimpse into this horrifying reality beyond our daily illusions. This is the most immediate effect of the Dionysian tragedy, that the state and society, and in general the gaps between man and man, give way to an overwhelming feeling of oneness, which leads back to the heart of nature. This is why Nietzsche says that the chorus, by its own, was too much to handle for the Greeks. But you might think to yourself that listening to music isn't such a horrible experience. In fact, most people love listening to music. They don't go a day without it. Well, aside from the fact that music has changed, and that there are different types of music, for Nietzsche, the ancient Greeks were unique. He considered them the highest culture that has ever existed, but that also means that they were the most sensitive to suffering. The deep-minded Hellene, who is so singularly qualified for the most delicate and severe suffering, consoles himself. He who has glanced with piercing eye into the very heart of the terrible, destructive processes of so-called universal history, as also into the cruelty of nature. This state of Dionysian rapture is too much to handle for a people so sensitive as the Greeks. It's an overdose of Dionysus, so to speak. All chaos, the complete destruction of all limits, of all individuality, of all ego, a glimpse beyond the comfortable illusions of daily existence into the dark and deep reality of things, an injection of suffering, a kind of torture, even. Therefore, this hefty dose of Dionysian poison needs a purgative. The Dionysian experience needs to be diluted, made less powerful. It needs to be paired with something else, in order to become bearable. A measure of the Apollonian is added to the Dionysian mixture. Dionysian music is interspersed with Apollonian text and action. In other words, drama. Tragedy is born. We must understand Greek tragedy as the Dionysian chorus, which always disburdens itself anew in an Apollonian world of pictures. The choric parts, therefore, with which tragedy is interlaced, are in a manner the mother womb of the entire so-called dialogue, that is, of the whole stage world, of the drama proper. Accordingly, the drama is the Apollonian embodiment of Dionysian perceptions and influences. The words and stage action, Apollonian in nature, are added to the tragic mix in order to make it bearable. As the saying goes, a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. We need the comfort of the illusion as the vehicle by which we arrive at the naked, cold, ugly truth. Now that tragedy is truly formed, we can explore how the illusion works. The Apollonian, the force of illusion, works its magic by introducing distance. It does so in two ways. First of all, the illusion of the actor. We know that the actor on stage isn't really King Oedipus. We know that he's just a man playing pretend. However, we also lose a sense of tragedy if we don't suspend our disbelief a little bit. So for the tragedy to have full effect, we, the audience, are tasked with simultaneously identifying with Oedipus while also realizing, in the back of our minds, that it's not really Oedipus there on stage. You can see how a measure of distance is thus introduced. If you were to completely identify with Oedipus, we couldn't handle it. Second of all, the entire experience of the play as a whole delivers distance. The words and drama present the audience with a general truth about human existence, namely that it is senseless suffering. But we can be spectators to all of this pain. We don't have to experience it for ourselves. Doing so would overwhelm us. We can watch Oedipus gouge out his own eyes without literally feeling the pain that he is going through. In other words, we are watching a simulation of a truly Dionysian experience. And that is the entire point of tragedy. And that is also why it needs Apollonian, that is to say, illusory elements. Without these elements, it would not be an illusion, it would be real. Too real. The true measure of tragedy is therefore how skillfully the playwright can integrate the Dionysian element of truth-telling music together with the Apollonian element of protective, illusion-building poetry. In the interplay of these forces, tragedy is born. However, at some point in Greek culture, this delicate balance became upset. In Nietzsche's words, Greek culture degenerated. At some point, Nietzsche argues, the Greeks became unable to engage with tragedy in the proper way. They lost some kind of essence. They lost a source of vitality and strength that made them robust enough to engage with the horrible truth that tragedy imparts. Over time, they required more illusion because they became too weak to handle the truth. The Apollonian gradually took away territory from the Dionysian, and tragedy, soon after being born, started to die. What is being hinted at here is the concept of degeneration, but young Nietzsche doesn't explicitly use this term. The seed is there, but it hasn't grown yet. Remember how Nietzsche republished this work 14 years later, after his philosophy had radically changed? Well, in a new foreword to the book, Nietzsche disavowed some aspects of this work, while affirming others. Many commentators have argued that this was an instance of Nietzsche trying to save face, as if he couldn't admit to himself that a work which he had written was now, in his eyes, so completely wrong. So, the argument goes, he engaged in mental gymnastics in order to fit these ideas into his later philosophy, as if he was right all along, only in some esoteric, hidden way, even hidden to himself. In doing so, he could convince his audience, as well as himself, that even though this work runs completely counter to his new philosophy, still his brilliant mind saw hints of the truth in some way. But here, In paragraph 12 of The Birth of Tragedy, we have the young Nietzsche hinting at one of the major themes of his later work. Without question, he refers here to a big idea that would gain in increasing importance in his later philosophy. Because in this paragraph, Nietzsche discusses the death of tragedy. And what has killed it? Or rather, who killed it? Well, none other than Socrates, the demon of Athens. But before we get to Socrates, we need to take a little detour. We must discuss one of the major three Athenian writers of tragedy, Euripides. Even though Euripides is often named in tandem with the two other famous Athenian playwrights, Sophocles and Aeschylus, Nietzsche considered him the odd one out. As a philologist who spent a lot of time analyzing these old plays, and who was intimately familiar with the contemporary scholarly debate on their merits, he agreed with the perception that existed at the time that Euripides represented a decline in poetic quality as compared to, for example, Sophocles. The relatively poor quality of Euripides is blamed on his intellectualizing. Euripides, more than his contemporaries, is a tragedian of explanation, of criticism, of rationalism. We will dive deeper into Nietzsche's criticism in a moment. For now, consider this quote in which Nietzsche doesn't mince words in relentlessly critiquing this icon of Western literature. The poetic deficiency and retrogression, which we are so often wont to impute to Euripides in comparison with Sophoclean tragedy, is for the most part the product of this penetrating critical process, this daring intelligibility. But what does Nietzsche mean exactly when he speaks of this critical process, this daring intelligibility? Perhaps an example is in order. The plays of Euripides have a somewhat different structure than those of his contemporaries. What is distinctive in his plays is the prologue. At the beginning of the play, Euripides will have a character, a god or a regular mortal, explain to the audience what has happened before and what has led up to the start of the play. Often, this character in the prologue will even spoil what will happen later on in the play. In the Euripidean dialogue, everything is explained and exposed. In his play, The Trojan Women, for example, he has Poseidon give the audience a brief recap of the events of the Trojan War. Meanwhile, in the prologue to Electra, the prologue spoils much of the plot. This constant exposition is an example of the intellectualizing of Euripides. Nietzsche analyzes Euripides as follows. Euripides wants the audience to know what will happen plot-wise, because only then are they able to fully immerse themselves in the emotions and feelings of the characters. Being thrown immediately into the action, without exposition as to what happens, was for Euripides an impediment to true immersion in the play. It was a distraction. The audience is busy figuring out what is happening on stage, instead of getting absorbed in the emotion. According to Euripides, the spectator was in a strange state of anxiety to make out the problem of the previous history, so that the poetic beauties and pathos of exposition were lost to him. We need to know, in overzealous detail, why Medea feels the way that she does. In other words, he needed the audience to understand first and feel later. For Euripides, this was the essence of tragedy, the primacy of the intellect, knowledge as a prerequisite for emotion. Whereas for other playwrights, part of the experience of tragedy was precisely in the suspense that is created when the audience doesn't know what's going on. In Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, we are thrown immediately into the action, and a mysterious prophecy about what will happen to the protagonist keeps us on our toes throughout the play. If Euripides had written the play instead, the ending of Oedipus Rex would have been spoiled at the start. Sophocles wanted suspense and a sense of uncertainty as to how the prophecy of the fate of the king Oedipus would ultimately be fulfilled. Euripides would have wanted the audience to know in advance what would happen, so we could focus on the mental state of Oedipus throughout the play. In the words of Nietzsche, the effect of Euripidean tragedy never depended on epic suspense, on the fascinating uncertainty as to what is to happen now and afterwards, but rather on the grand rhetorical-lyric scenes in which the passion and dialectics of the chief hero swelled to a broad and mighty stream. So long as the spectator has to divine the meaning of this or that person, or the presuppositions of this or that conflict of inclinations and intentions, his complete absorption in the doings and sufferings of the chief persons is impossible, as is likewise breathless fellow-feeling and fellow-fearing. So Euripides explains the play before it even starts, by having a character reveal the plot in the prologue. Euripides is also famous for making a lot of use of the deus ex machina, with some arguing that he even invented the literary device. More than half of his tragedies, those that survive at least, employ this technique. The deus ex machina, literally the god from the machine, is a god who appears as a character at the end of the play to resolve the drama. In Medea, for example, the sun god Helios appears at the very end to carry Medea away to Athens, where she can be safe. He arrives in a chariot, drawn by a dragon, hence the machine part. It was a spectacle, and even though today we use the term deus ex machina in a derogatory way to describe lazy or bad writing, for the ancient Greeks, this appearance of a god must have been experienced differently. In any case, this deus ex machina ending is yet another instance of Euripides spelling out what happens in the play. It's the equivalent of the "and they lived happily ever after" at the end of a fairy tale. The emphasis is on how the plot gets resolved. Euripidean tragedy cannot handle ambiguous endings. We need to know, we need to be sure that the protagonist is safe and has a happy, or at least resolved, ending. Otherwise, we might worry about what happens to our hero, and this would distract us from the drama. So we are presented with a prologue full of exposition, and an ending full of exposition. What happens in between? That's where the drama occurs. But the style of Euripides is markedly different from Sophocles or Aeschylus. Euripides is often regarded as a rationalist writer. His characters are realistic. He focuses on their mental states, their inner struggles, their doubts, and their fears. We cannot go too deep into how his style and content differs from the two other Athenian writers, but suffice to say that Euripides, in short, places emphasis on the rhetoric and the literature of his plays. For him, that is where the drama comes from. More than his contemporaries, he also brings Greek gods down to the human level. In the Bacchae, for example, the god Dionysus is the main character. And while he is still a powerful god, here he is also presented as human, with nuanced feelings. He is not a cardboard cutout, but a fully fleshed out character. Euripides has even been accused of atheism for his treatment of the gods in his plays. While for Sophocles and Aeschylus, the gods entertain a pathos of distance between themselves and mortals. They, the superior, mortals, the inferior. That brings us back to Nietzsche. What is Nietzsche's ultimate accusation against Euripides? That he is an agent of decadence. With Euripidean tragedy, a new form of art is created, but the old tragedy is thereby destroyed. He stands accused of removing the mythical and chanting underpinning of old tragedy. His characters engage in rhetoric, and they act as if they are contemporary Athenians instead of mythic heroes of ages past. In a way, he modernized his characters. He lifted them from the world of myth and placed them in our own. So what did Euripides do? He removed the Dionysian element from tragedy. He stressed the Apollonian. In Nietzsche's view, he therefore upset a delicate balance, the synergistic dance between two primeval forces of tragedy. Apollo and Dionysus worked together to create Greek tragedy. Now one half is gone, and everything is ruined. Euripides may have been an agent of decadence, but he was not the cause. To find the cause, we must talk about Socrates. I shall now indicate the close connection between Socrates and Euripides. We know from ancient sources that Socrates never really went to the theater, except when a play of Euripides was performed. We also know that the Delphic oracle once said that Socrates is the wisest of men, and Euripides second. So let's dig a little deeper. Socrates represents the dawn of a new Greek culture. With the arrival of Socrates, reason as opposed to instinct will reign supreme in the moral framework of the Greeks. The story of Socrates is well known. Known as the gadfly of Athens, he would pester local noblemen and politicians and interrogate them on their values. What is justice? What is truth? What is beauty? With his trademark Socratic irony, he'd say that he himself knows nothing, and that he's only asking questions. And time and again, he would find that these noblemen would profess to being just and truthful, but that in fact, they couldn't define these values against the inquisitive Socrates. He exposed their lack of having good reasons for their tightly held beliefs. They practiced them only by instinct. He perceived, to his astonishment, that all these celebrities were without a proper and accurate insight, even with regard to their own callings, and practiced them only by instinct. Only by instinct. With this phrase, we touch upon the heart and core of the Socratic tendency. What typifies the Socratic tendency is the idea that whatever is without reason is also objectionable. A core tenet of Socrates is that all evil that men do stems from ignorance. If only people knew how to act in a just way, they'd always act in accordance to this value. In other words, rationality equals goodness. Socrates insists that we must have good reasons for doing what we do and thinking what we think. And the implication is that when such reasons are lacking, what we are doing and what we are thinking obviously can be good. The same goes for art. We must have good reasons for designating one piece of art as beautiful and another as ugly. Without such reasons, no good art is possible. Wherever Socratism turns its searching eyes, it beholds the lack of insight and the power of illusion, and from this lack infers the inner perversity and objectionableness of existing conditions. From this point onwards, Socrates believed that he was called upon to correct existence. But is it really true that whatever is without reason is objectionable? Nietzsche not only disagrees with this sentiment, he flips it on its head. But we'll get to that. The point is that Socrates functions as the catalyst for a change in Hellenic culture. Who is it that ventures single-handed to disown the Greek character, which, as Homer, Pindar, and Aeschylus, as Phidias, as Pericles, as Pythia and Dionysus, as the deepest abyss and the highest height, is sure of our wandering admiration? With Socrates, rationality over emotion becomes the standard. All art, too, must have good reasons behind it. Instinct is regarded with suspicion. Art, therefore, becomes goal-driven. It must serve a rational purpose. But for Nietzsche, Socratic rationalism is dissuasive. It always prevents something. Instincts, on the other hand, are the primeval creative force. This paradigm is readily apparent in how we, in the modern age, think about things. We have instincts, and then we have rationality to rein in those instincts. Can you see where this is going? We have an overflowing creative force, an outpouring of emotion, of instinct on the one hand, and a principle of limitation, of delineation on another. We have Dionysus and we have Apollo. And we can see clearly which of the two is favored by Socrates. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Now let's turn our eye back to Greek tragedy again and revisit Euripides, the Athenian writer who succumbed to this Socratic tendency. Earlier, we mentioned the emphasis of European tragedy on lyric and rhetoric, and how his characters behave like contemporary Athenians, how he has his characters defend their actions, explain their motives. In short, with Euripides, reasons become important. This is but one instance of Socratic influence. When we alluded to the Deus ex machina earlier, this was also an outgrowth of Socrates, because the Deus ex machina is the narrative device by which a clear link between knowledge and virtue is established. The virtuous hero must now be a dialectician. There must now be a necessary, visible connection between virtue and knowledge, between belief and morality. The transcendental justice of the plot in Aeschylus is now degraded to the superficial and audacious principle of poetic justice with its usual Deus ex machina. The emphasis on dialectics leads to the death of tragedy, because the entire framework of rationality and reason stands opposed to what made Greek tragedy tragic, that is, the Dionysian element. Tragedy was dying a slow death because over time the Greeks started to think the chorus became less and less important. How does the chorus, and in general the entire Dionyso-musical substratum of tragedy, now appear in light of this new Socrato-optimistic stage world? As something accidental, as a readily dispensable reminiscence of the origin of tragedy, while we have in fact seen that the chorus can be understood only as the cause of tragedy and of the tragic generally. As the full title of The Birth of Tragedy says, tragedy was born out of the spirit of music. But now, music is discarded, and tragedy has died. And with it, art in general. This is where Nietzsche blames Socrates for the death of tragedy and true art, but not as a cause, but rather as the greatest expression of an underlying new idea in Greek culture, namely the primacy of reason. Nietzsche will revisit and expand on this topic in a much later work, Twilight of the Idols. We've done 2 videos on that dive deeper in the subject. First, a dedicated video on Nietzsche and Socrates, but also our big analysis of the entire work of Twilight of the Idols. Link in the description. The Socratic tendency, which took over Greek culture, has killed tragic art. The shadow of Socrates extends until the present day, the 19th century, when Nietzsche was writing these words. What is to be done? A revival is needed. Where will the revival come from? Well, if tragedy is born out of music, we will need a musical revival. Broadly speaking, the birth of tragedy is made up of 2 parts. The first part deals with Apollo and Dionysus, Socrates and Euripides, in short, with the birth of tragedy. The second part deals with Richard Wagner. Commentators will sometimes say that the birth of tragedy is essentially Nietzsche's love letter to Wagner. And there is definitely some truth to this. For one, the book is literally dedicated to him. We must keep in mind that The Birth of Tragedy was Nietzsche's first major work, and while it received poor academic reception, it was wildly popular in Wagnerian circles. Nietzsche and Wagner had a close relationship at this point in time. By all accounts, Nietzsche was starstruck by Wagner, the world-famous superstar artist of his time. And Wagner, for his part, could boast that the brilliant young Professor Nietzsche would sing the praises of his work and lend credibility to his art. A bigger compliment is practically impossible. Here we have a work in which the rise and fall of Greek tragedy is investigated as the high point of the greatest culture that has ever existed. And the grand conclusion is that the time is ripe for a revival of this great epoch with the music of none other than Wagner himself. According to Nietzsche, Wagner was quite literally going to save Western civilization. How was this revival supposed to occur? Nietzsche believed that the Socratic force exerts its influence up until the present day, which is to say the 19th century. But certain developments in contemporary culture have once again made possible the potential of tragedy in the ancient Greek Dionysian style. Let's quickly revisit Socrates, the primacy of reason, virtue as knowledge, the search for abstract generalizations using logic and dialectic. These things have driven philosophy and Western culture ever since Socrates roamed the streets of Athens. But at the time of writing The Birth of Tragedy, the limits of this search had been reached. 2 German philosophers had exposed the Socratic tendency as ultimately unsatisfactory. They are Immanuel Kant and Arthur Schopenhauer. Kant had shown the impossibility of metaphysics by investigating reason itself. Schopenhauer built upon this foundation and found a source of morality that is not found in knowledge, as Socrates would have it, but in compassion. Moreover, Schopenhauer posited the existence of the will, something fundamentally irrational, as underpinning all of reality. The developments in philosophy brought forth by these men run counter to the general Socratic tendency that elevated reason and rationality as the source of truth and goodness. In other words, they paved the way for a new path, a new direction for philosophy and culture, something not based on rationality and reason, something based on feeling even. In other words, the gates have once again opened, and the Dionysian can once again find a place in our culture. At least, that's how Nietzsche saw it. And in support of this position, he argued that the music of Ludwig van Beethoven was the first step towards the realization of this renewed Dionysian force. Because German music, too, according to Nietzsche, arose out of this Dionysian root. Both German philosophy and German music point towards something anti-Socrates to something pro-Dionysus. German music, as we have to understand it, especially in its vast solar orbit from Bach to Beethoven, from Beethoven to Wagner. What even under the most favorable circumstances can the knowledge-craving Socratism of our days do with this demon, rising from unfathomable depths? This convergence of music and philosophy precipitates a new direction for Western culture, a revival of the Dionysian ideal. Yet it's not simply a repeat of ancient Greek culture. It's something new, to be sure. But we have nowhere else to turn, says Nietzsche, but to the ancient Greeks, to find a suitable analogy, a fitting vocabulary to describe just what this revival of culture will look like. To what, then, does the mystery of this oneness of German music and philosophy point? if not to a new form of existence, concerning the substance of which we can only inform ourselves presently from Hellenic analogies. This new form of existence is to find expression in the Wagnerian music drama. Richard Wagner, aside from writing the libretto and music for his operas, also wrote at length about his aesthetic ideals. The most important of those ideals was his desire to subsume all art forms into one organic whole. This ideal has come to be known with the German term Gesamtkunstwerk. In short, both the lyrics and the music should serve an equal function in the operatic drama, without either of them gaining supremacy over the other. Actually, Wagner's ideal doesn't just concern text and music, but also stage decoration, costumes, etc. In other words, in Wagner's ideal, every single aspect of opera should come together as one whole, each separate part being subservient to the drama. You can see where this is going. Wagner is trying to once again create a synthesis between the lyrical content of a drama and its music. Superficially, he did this as a reaction to the popular genre of grand opera, which he called a monstrosity with nonsensical plots and musical numbers written for easy consumption. But on a deeper level, by conjoining lyrics and music, he is once again striving for the Greek ideal, the marriage of Dionysus and Apollo, a rebirth of tragedy. For this alleged love letter to Wagner's art, the birth of tragedy itself is remarkably subtle in its praise. Nietzsche doesn't explicitly say that Wagner will save the tragic ideal, but the implication is clear. Greek mythology, once put to stage by writers such as Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides, has now found its successor in Wagnerian opera. Chiefly, Nietzsche is thinking of Wagner's Ring cycle, Der Ring des Nibelungen, a epic 4-part, 16-hour-long gargantuan effort to put a Germanic myth to stage. Just as the Greek writers used their cultural baggage and mythology to create tragedy, so does Wagner with German folklore. So instead of a tragedy about King Oedipus or the Trojan War, we have in the Ring cycle the grand story of Siegfried and Brunhilde, Fafner the dragon, Albrecht the dwarf. Mount Olympus is replaced by the castle of Valhalla. Wotan and Fricka take the place of Zeus and Hera. Wagner's own strict criteria for what constitutes good opera and good drama were most perfectly realized in the first 2 operas of the Ring cycle, Das Rheingold and Die Walküre. In the subsequent parts of Siegfried and Götterdämmerung, Wagner loosened up a bit and wrote more traditional opera. But that's not the biggest problem on the horizon. In a matter of years, Wagner would fall out of favor with Nietzsche. And Nietzsche, the writer of The Birth of Tragedy, would in a short few years completely disavow his own work and express regret that Wagner couldn't live up to his high expectations. Nietzsche and Wagner had a personal falling out, from friends to enemies, but on a more philosophical level, Nietzsche would also have a falling out with himself. Remember that The Birth of Tragedy is written by a young Nietzsche, a devout disciple of Schopenhauer. Not long after its publication, Nietzsche would turn against Schopenhauer and change his mind completely. In consequence, The Birth of Tragedy, which is built on Schopenhauerian foundations, would also have to crumble. Nietzsche will make an effort to retain some parts of it, like trying to save precious possessions from a house fire. Let's take a look at how he does this. In 1886, 14 years after its original publication, The Birth of Tragedy was reissued. The new edition had a different subtitle. Whereas the first book focused on music as the birthing ground of tragedy, the new edition carries the following title: The Birth of Tragedy, or Hellenism and Pessimism. This gives us a first hint as to where exactly this new Nietzsche disagreed with his old self. But more importantly, this new issue was accompanied by a new foreword by Nietzsche, entitled An Attempt at Self-Criticism. While the bulk of the book remains unchanged, in this new foreword, Nietzsche will state explicitly how and why he changed his mind, and explain his thought process behind it. He will disavow some parts of this youthful work, but also attempt to rescue other parts of it. In doing so, he attempts to save this work by giving it a place in his larger body of work, by which time this has grown quite considerable. Aside from his formal complaints, he calls the book too long, too verbose, self-indulgent even, he has some issues with the contents of the work. First of all, he disagrees now with the metaphysical underpinnings of his theory of tragedy, because he stopped believing in Schopenhauer's theory of the will. But that's not the most important point. As the new subtitle points to, Nietzsche wants to talk about pessimism, more specifically, where pessimism comes from, and why the Greeks, this jubilant, joyful culture, were precisely the culture to invent tragedy and revel in the Dionysian. Perhaps I should now speak more guardedly and less eloquently of a psychological question so difficult as the origin of tragedy among the Greeks. Nietzsche's new insight, paradoxically, is that Greek pessimism came from a place of abundance and joy. That might sound strange, and Nietzsche isn't even sure if pessimism is the right word for this state of mind, but he sticks to the term Dionysian pessimism in any case. So let's dig a little deeper. Schopenhauer's view on tragedy is that it exposes the audience to the fundamental truth of life, that it is suffering and can never satisfy us. In tragedy, then, we come to realize that life itself cannot be worth very much. Thus, tragedy leads to resignation. Nietzsche agrees with basically all of that, except for the conclusion. Insight into the suffering of the world should not lead to resignation, but to its opposite. It should lead to an affirmation, saying yes instead of no to life. He considered it a decidedly modern idea, that when faced with suffering, our instinct should say no. It's a symptom of decadence. For the Greeks, it was different. In the Dionysian pessimism of the Greeks, the same suffering of life leads to a challenge to live joyfully and abundantly nonetheless in the face of all the suffering. The idea is completely foreign to us in the modern age, and a large part of Nietzsche's philosophical project is to allow us to feel this great affirmation of life. The Greeks possessed a type of strength that we have lost, the strength to look at overwhelming odds and pain and suffering and to stare at the abyss and say, bring it on, challenge accepted. And not in a dramatic, heroic way, but in a light, dancing, joyful manner. As Nietzsche himself puts it, you should learn to laugh, my young friends, if you are at all determined to remain pessimists. And this new foreword to the birth of tragedy ends with an excerpt from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche's ultimate spokesperson for this Dionysian pessimism, who raised the challenge for us to surpass ourselves, surpass mankind, to overcome these modern ailments and live joyfully and abundantly, like the Greeks before us. It's an open-ended challenge, which is yet to be completed. Zarathustra announces the arrival of the Übermensch, indicating that as of yet, such a man has not appeared. So let's return to the question at hand. Nietzsche changed his mind on some important ideas in The Birth of Tragedy. So what remains of this work, in light of Nietzsche's new outlook? Interestingly enough, despite disagreeing with himself on fundamental ideas, much of the work, quote-unquote, survives. His critique of Socrates, for example, his genealogy of Greek tragedy, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, if they cannot be real metaphysical drives, could at least be characterized as inclinations. Music, even if it loses its metaphysical significance, still remains the highest art form. However, Nietzsche believed that he was completely wrong on the question of Richard Wagner. Rather than being the grand savior of Western culture, with a revitalization of the ancient Greek spirit through his Germanic music dramas, Nietzsche came to view Wagner as merely another symptom of decadence, a more subtle, insidious strain of that disease, Wagner the hypnotist, who succeeded in leading Nietzsche astray. As such, much of the final parts of The Birth of Tragedy are completely disavowed by Nietzsche. And of course, Nietzsche changed his mind on the fundamental value of art and tragedy. What is the purpose of tragedy, and how does it relate to life? The old Nietzsche would say that it shows us the brutality of the world, but allows us a moment of pause as we revel in the delight of Apollonian forms coupled with Dionysian ecstasy and a great dance of these two primeval aesthetic forces. For the new Nietzsche, the Apollonian becomes not that important, while the Dionysian is expanded and changes meaning. The Dionysian is now not only the force of chaos, the blurring of lines, the power of music. Dionysus now becomes symbol for life itself, in all its ever-changing, dark and deep aspects. Taking this topic any further would be too much for this video, however. If you want us to do a deep dive on Dionysus, let us know in the comments. We've done a big video as well on what we've called Nietzsche's mistake, where we discuss this change of mind as it relates to romanticism and pessimism. We've covered a lot of ground in this video. For such a short book, The Birth of Tragedy speaks on a variety of different subjects. We've talked about the Apollonian and Dionysian drives, perhaps the most lasting legacy of this work. But in spite of the enduring influence of these two terms in the artistic domains, What is perhaps most important in The Birth of Tragedy as it relates to Nietzsche's later philosophy is his critique of Socrates. With the Socratic Revolution, Nietzsche foresaw a movement in Greek culture away from instinct and passion towards reason and rationality, a movement that continued up until this day. A large part of Nietzsche's philosophical project was to bring instinct to the forefront again, as something real and important, perhaps even more important than rationality, reason, or dialectics. Because Nietzsche would center his later philosophy around a concept that wasn't conceived of when he wrote The Birth of Tragedy. We are speaking of the famous will to power, the ultimate expression of a healthy instinct, a desire for power. In fact, Nietzsche would argue that all so-called rational philosophies stand diametrically opposed to this fundamental instinct, as tools for the weak, exemplified by the ugly outcast Socrates. Dialectics and the sway of argument were invented to convince the strong to lay down their arms and to view their strength not as a blessing, but as a curse. And the success of this revolution has made us all sick, degenerate. Ultimately, it would be up to the Übermensch, with Nietzsche and Zarathustra as his prophet, to rehabilitate mankind and surpass ourselves beyond good and evil. Is The Birth of Tragedy worth reading? Of course it is. We hope that with this video, we've delivered a valuable guide in your efforts to read it. If you found this video valuable, please leave a like, a comment, and a subscribe. It helps out the channel a great deal. Our goal is to eventually cover every major work of Nietzsche in videos like these, and we're well on our way. So subscribe to the channel and tag along with our journey. If you want to support the work we're doing here even more, feel free to take a look at our Patreon page where we have a backlog of exclusive videos for members only. A great way to support the channel and get some extra content all in one. With that said, thank you for watching and we'll see you in the next one.